In 1943, a naval engineer knocked a spring off a shelf, and instead of picking it up and moving on with his life, he just sat there and watched it walk. That's the entire origin of a toy that would eventually sell hundreds of millions of units worldwide. Not a plan, not a market study, a dropped spring that refused to just fall like a normal object. The engineer's name was Richard James, and at the time he wasn't trying to invent anything fun at all. He was working on a completely different problem, developing tension springs that could stabilize sensitive equipment on Navy ships during rough seas. One day, one of his prototype springs slipped off a shelf in his workshop. Instead of dropping straight down, it flipped end over end, coiled itself upright, and kept walking across the floor and onto a stack of books like it had somewhere to be. Most engineers would have just picked it up. Richard James went home and told his wife, Betty James, that he thought he'd stumbled onto a toy. Betty is actually the reason this story doesn't end as a forgotten patent. She's the one who came up with the name, flipping through a dictionary until she landed on the word Slinky, meaning stealthy and sleek, which somehow perfectly described a spring that seemed to move like a tiny metal snake. Here's where the story gets genuinely wild. The couple borrowed $500, had a factory produce the first batch of Slinkies, and set up a demonstration table at Gimbels department store in Philadelphia in 1945. They had no idea if anyone would care about a plain metal spring with no batteries, no buttons, and no obvious purpose beyond, well, walking downstairs. Richard James actually had to rig a small inclined ramp on the table himself, tilting it just enough that the spring would flip end over end on its own, because without seeing it move, it just looked like a coil of scrap metal. Then he let it walk. They sold their entire first run, 400 units, in 90 minutes. Since then, the Slinky has sold more than 300 million units, been inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame, and even flown on NASA space missions, where astronauts used it to study the physics of springs in zero gravity. In the 1990s, it also became the inspiration for a certain stretchy toy dog in a very famous animated film, proving the design was flexible enough to reinvent itself decades later without changing a single coil. All from a prototype that was never supposed to be a toy in the first place. But here's the twist almost nobody knows. Richard James, the man who accidentally invented one of the best-selling toys in American history, didn't stick around to enjoy the payoff. In the 1960s, he left the company, gave away much of his fortune, and moved to Bolivia to join a religious community, leaving Betty to run the entire company on her own. And Betty didn't just keep it running. She took over as CEO with no formal business background, restructured the company's debts, kept the Slinky in production, and eventually became one of the most successful female executives in American toy manufacturing at a time when that was almost unheard of. She's the reason you can still buy a Slinky today. So the accident wasn't really the spring falling off the shelf. The real accident, the lucky one, was that Richard James happened to be paying attention at the exact moment something ordinary did something strange, and that his wife happened to have the instincts to turn a strange little moment into an actual business. Most people who drop something just pick it up. Once in a great while, someone watches it fall a little longer and ends up building an empire out of the thing everyone else would have stepped over.